Okay, here we are for PPM56, continuing on with Chapter 4 from Being and Learning. This material originally written on this day, April the 9th, 2004, and read here 10 years later, April the 9th, 2014. This corresponds to pages 89 through the top of 91 in the published Being and Learning. So yesterday, this main theme that came up was an actual response to the question, or there was an attempt to take up the question of preparation, right? So a number of days ago I posed the question, in what sense can we talk of one being prepared to receive the call and the offering of learning? The call of learning would be the what I've called the message or the tidings that are offered by the sage. But those are that message is something that is sort of pointing towards the sort of fundamental or originary offering, which is the offering from being, right? So that the relationship that's captured in the title of the book, called Being and Learning, is the fundamental relationship between the human and their freedom, right? Humans and our freedom, and that's experienced with a sort of revelation of that freedom. The freedom isn't something that we have, it's something that we find ourselves to be in, or to be in relationship to. And so I use the term being and being's presencing as a way of talking about the disclosure of that freedom, which is not entirely ours, but is something that is offered to us, right? So we don't make our freedom, and it's not something that we quote-unquote own, but it's something that essentially defines us, or fundamentally defines us. And so then the relationship we have with that freedom is what I call learning. And what we do with our freedom is what I call learning as well. So this notion that we do something with our freedom, that we make something with our freedom, and I'm saying in a very neutral, non-value laden, insofar as one can say that, you know, the specificity of the person comes through, obviously, most intensely, and our singularity comes through in our enactment of our freedom, but we cannot say that, I'm trying to say that freedom, the way I'm using it, is in a certain way a universal category, or that stands for the possibility of human agency, if you will, the possibility of human beings making a move, as some like to say, or doing something, that brings something into the world, or even caring for the world. So the question then of whether or not we can be prepared for the offering to take up our freedom, to take up learning, I took that up in yesterday's meditation, and what I talked about it, because I'm still going through Plato's allegory of the cave, is this notion that, well, perhaps we can talk of the truth of concealment. That is to say that the preparation that we could say that we have is not one that really, and through Plato's allegory, can be understood in messianic terms, insofar as we can talk about preparing for something that, you know, the imminent arrival of something to come, the freedom to come. Because that's always based on two things, at least. One is the memory of a time before oppression, before slavery, and then the other is prophecy, right? So someone from within the current or immediate past has spoken of a time when there will be this emancipation. In the allegory of the cave, that's not possible, because they have no memory of a past, right? They have no memory of having ever lived outside of it, have no perspective. So they dwell within what I want to call the one side of the truth of aletheia, which is the truth of concealment. And that's how they're prepared, by living within that sort of darkness of withdrawal, or the darkness of concealment, that they're already sort of in a state of preparation for the flooding of the light, if you want to use that metaphor, of disclosure, the shining forth. And I'm fully aware, as I have Walter Mignolo's book on my desk here, The Darker Side of the Renaissance, I'm fully aware of the complexity and the potential problematic use of this language that I'm I'm using here when I talk of disclosure through shining and concealment through darkness. And I'm not going to weigh in and sort of defend my use of that language at this point here. I just wanted to give some context. Okay, so moving forward. To identify the circumstances of the cave, specifically the bondage imposed by those who have chosen unfreedom upon those who thereby have in effect no perspective, because they remain unconscious. That is to say, not conscious, ignorant, unaware of, temporarily deprived of consciousness. To identify the circumstance of the cave, thus as a preparatory condition, is to identify the structure of the story as a process of unfolding within the dynamic of the twofold play. The final turning is the exemplar of the twofold play's presencing, where we see the liberated one's struggle momentarily culminating in a sublime repose before the revelation of the essence of relationality, then immediately giving way to a longing for his companions to join him. If we return to the first part of the story, we can observe how the presence of the twofold play is the way of the process that unfolds in this tale. With this retelling of the story, we might gather an understanding of the truth of concealment as always already preparing the way of the truth in the way the abyss always already maintains the possibility of the creation of meaning. The truth of concealment is most profoundly revealed in the first part of the story, where we are offered a portrait of the encounter with the saying of wu-i-wu, nothingness, which, as we said above, reveals the bottomless abyss and thereby creates a feeling of utter forlornness. Within the context of the allegory, the appearance of this feeling occurs at the first and final turnings. It motivates the initial releasement of the chains and the calling of the liberated one to turn around, and appears again with the pity that comes forth in the longing to return. We will come back to explore this further. Here we recall identifying the saying of wu-i-wu, of being held out into the nothing, and now recognize why this saying is addressed to the domestic habitat that it retains the conditions for the possibility of learning. The provocative tidings that dismantle the certainty of the juridical subject are addressed to his abode. This home now appears as the truth of concealment, manifesting in the habitation from which the unconscious subject will be drawn. As we said above, when the subject is subjugated to the alterity of the autre, he is addressed by what is not yet, not yet. And the subject is taunted in this moment, his judgment is abandoned, for his ground has been shaken, and he has been deprived of a foundation. The confrontation is recognized as destruction, and this is why an abyss appears in the saying of wu-i-wu. Abyssus, abusus, a without, busos, depth, bottomless, profound, and unfathomable, primeval chaos. The first part of the allegory reveals how the saying of wu-i-wu reveals the twofold play as the always already not yet, the possibility that emerges through the passing over, through, and emerging from the abyss. Here in the first part of the story, the abyss is represented by the strict limits of the cave, the unilocular, and the strict limits of the view of those held in bondage, uni-ocular. The abode where the evocative tidings are addressed and received is the abyss from which the apprentice will appear. Learning is the processual unfolding of the twofold play of concealment and unconcealment. The twofold play that gets underway because the apprentice emerges or appears from the abode of concealment when he receives the evocative saying that reveals the truth of concealment he resides in. This revelation awakens the one who has been unconscious, and the apprenticeship gets underway. The truth of concealment is identified in the preparatory nature of the abyss. Part 1 of the story shows us that learning gets underway and is kept underway, wandering, by the twofold play, specifically the side of concealment, the no-thing, the unconscious, that enables the poetic saying to be received as provocative and irritating. This is precisely why the companions receive the one who has returned in such an inhospitable manner. They are genuinely provoked by the modality he offers them when he returns with damaged eyes. To properly receive the offering of the evocative saying, one must be situated in the unilateral abode, for this location alone preserves the essence of concealment, which plays the role of preparing the possibility of learning by maintaining the condition of certainty, which offers up the structure to undergo destruction. The truth of concealment is identified in the necessity of this phenomenon maintaining the always already that alone preserves the not yet, the possibility of responding, of creating, of learning. The truth of concealment as one side of the twofold play is identified in the preparatory character of bondage. Liberation is the authentic modality of learning, as the authentic modality of learning retains the memory of bondage, a memory that is retained both in the very character of relationality, which is maintained in the inescapability of rootedness, the singularity of subjectivity, and connectivity, the communality of subjectivity, intersubjectivity. To be with others and the world is to be situated, is to be rooted, and this rootedness is a modality from which one does not escape, and within the context of the allegory represents the inescapability of the cave, the domestic abode, the longing for others, that together make up the condition for the possibility of the leap beyond. The leap is taken from somewhere. The wandering begins and always unfolds from somewhere. This is the Da of Heidegger's Dasein, the being there, from which and in which we are always already situated. The essence of the being there is the truth of concealment. As we now get underway with our retelling of the allegory, we might have some sense of how those who maintain the conditions of the cave represent the essence of the tradition, the past, the educators who prepare the apprentice for the leap, a moment that can only arrive when one is prepared to become an apprentice. Those who maintain and perform within the theater of delusion are thus preparing the way for learning. And this preparation is rooted in the originary moment of the twofold play, the abyss from which appearance unfolds, the primeval chaos from which the creative act shines forth. And that's how I end it. So here is the first moment of returning back to the style and the form of the earlier meditations, which kind of broke off stylistically. The phenomenology and the writing broke off with the more close exegetical analysis and presentation of the allegory of the cave. But now as I made my way sort of beyond the presentation and the exegesis of the allegory, sort of return to that more poetic phenomenological work and return specifically to some key terminology and key phrases, one of them being the Latin term for abyss, right, without depth, abyssus, abusus, without depth, which I suppose you could say means no depth, but the point is that it is bottomless. And so what this is now representing is going to be this gap and this fundamental break that it has to exist. On the one hand, it's from within this gap or this bottomless abyss that I'm saying, you know, and I'm not saying it, but I'm borrowing from past philosophy, that from this depth arises what's being shown to us, right? And so in that sense, I'm arguing that the cave represents the necessary place that one has to be in, not only to begin with, but always, right? So that's the point of talking about being rooted and being in relations with others. That's why in the most recent work that I wrote, I talked about the heat of the hell of other people, using Sartre's idea that hell is other people, that the heat generated from that quote-unquote hell of being with other people creates the funk, which is to say the groove from which we make something together, that is to say music. Now that paper is quite far in terms of its terminology from this work, but it's the same point, that we need our relationality with other people, and that's why the idea of friendship is so important. Even with friendship, that there's this tension of actually needing other people, that we're incomplete without other people. This is part of our situation. So our need for others, and then not only that, but our being sort of rooted in our relations with others, that our being is rooted in our relations with others, that we are always sort of returning back to a home, that, as Arendt says, we require that. We require the darkness, if you will, quote unquote, of the night for sleep. We require the privacy. So darkness can also represent privacy of the home, right? So the space of the domestic. All this is required for us to sort of break free from. In other words, we need it. We need the domestic. We need the space that I'm in right here, which is kind of ironic, to get out there. So it's sort of, I guess, in a certain way, I'm positioning myself in a place that kind of dramatizes the point I'm trying to make. That if not for this safety, quote unquote, of the cave, we can't go out into the free space of the open region, to use some Heidegger's language. So this is why there is this twofold play, and the twofold play is the relationship between, quote unquote, the truth of concealment, everything I just talked about, the domestic, our relations with others, our being with others, our need to be with others, our need for a warm place to, a cave, quote unquote, a den from which we can, rest from the world. That's the truth of concealment. And truth here means the reality and the necessity of it. Not truth in the sense of, logical truth, something that we prove. It's just truth stands for the reality of it and the necessity of it. So the necessity of concealment is necessary. The reality of it is necessary because without it we can't burst free. It's sort of like Arendt talks about the ground, and so this is a great time to talk about this because we have winter, which is like, a powerful presence and overwhelming, at least here in this part of the world, in Maine, winter, and it's literal concealment of the ground with the snow and the ice, and of, heat withdrawing, right? And then all of a sudden, the temperature becomes warmer, the sun and the relationship between sun and earth shifts, the air becomes a little warmer, and then the ground loosens up, and from the ground appears these beautiful little flowers and the first signs of spring. So life returns, but it returns from the ground. That's my point. And so this is the key here, this notion that without the ground, without the darkness of the ground, without the which is fecund, right? It's fertile. Without the fertile darkness of the ground, there is nothing emerging, right? And so we remain rooted in the ground. And this then is going back to the sort of from chapter 3, the earlier writings about the rootedness and returning to the roots. So the ground, the cave then is now being, I'm sort of turning it around and saying, and this is why I've talked about the cave dwellers as forming a demos, right? So on the surface it looks like the cave's a bad place, and we got to get out of the cave, and it's it's the theater of deception. But then when we reread it and we rewrite it, we start talking about the necessity of the cave and the need to have this cave as this underground, if you will, or ground from which we emerge, but we also return. So I'm going to leave it at that for today.